All right, hang on, there we go. Okay, let's get started here. All right, perfect. Wow, happy Wednesday. You're halfway through the week as of the end of today, so that is, I guess, good news. Okay, so, no, it's all good. The first tray table of the day. There's always one. All right. So today we're going to keep going talking about concepts and theories. I've got a bunch of stuff on Marxism, and I try to blast through it and then get to some alternative views, especially of how we talk about the value of work from an economic perspective. I don't think there's anything I need to tell you other than that. I guess add drop is coming up, so if you either know people who want in, or I think we got 6 spots left in the class, or you know people, you are one of the people who want to get out, do so with alacrity, or you will be in this class for the rest of the term. Okay, so we were talking last time about kind of the Marxist view of labor, Marxist economics in general, right? So we talked about classical economics or liberal economics from Adam Smith, and then we moved into what's probably the dominant strain of economics in sociology, right? And if you if you do go through the textbook, and again, the textbook's optional, excuse me, if you do end up going through the textbook, one of the things you're going to find is that the authors, 2 of whom I know who worked in this, one is retired now and the other one still works in the department, really do come at the question of labor a lot of times from a Marxist kind of economic perspective. And that's very common in sociology. Okay, so again, maybe I'll turn that down a little, hearing some echo. Okay, with Marxist economics, right, what Marx is really concerned about is this, right, surplus value. The idea that capitalism creates all of this extra value in products, right? So basically, once you factor in the cost of raw materials and labor, whatever else you can sell that product for, is the surplus value that the industrial process creates. And we call that profit, right? And we think of profit as a good thing. But for Marx, it's slightly problematic, simply because he thinks the goal of the bourgeoisie, all right, what the bourgeoisie is after, the owners of the means of production, is increasing their surplus values as much and how much they get to keep of it, essentially by making the lives of workers as bad as possible, right? Giving them just enough to sustain themselves. And this leads, workers to having very poor living conditions and a lot of income inequality, right? This is what we would kind of call it today. The owners of the means of production have a lot of wealth. The workers have very little. Okay. So Marx, like Adam Smith before him, has what's called a labor theory of value, right? So basically, in kind of Marxist terms, when we talk about the labor theory of value, is that the economic value of a good or service is determined by the average number of hours necessary to produce it, right? So basically the labor that goes into it. How much time did that worker trade of their life to make that product? That's the value of it, right? That's the extra that's added to raw materials that makes it valuable to people. Okay, typically in Marxist theories, it's suggested that without the labor of the proletariat, the raw materials and the capital that are controlled by the bourgeoisie, so the capital, right, the money and the raw materials are basically worthless, right? They are essentially without value because they can't be turned into a product that's valuable to sell without the labor of workers. So for Marxists, right, and you'll still hear this being kicked around, I think more at a popular level and in disciplines that aren't always particularly economically literate, like sociology. Not every sociologist, but a lot of sociologists, I would say, don't have great economic literacy. They will kind of ascribe to this notion, right, that surplus value and profit are theft, right? So I got my Karl Marx picture here. Profit is theft. You'll still hear this kicked around, sometimes at protest, anti-capitalist protests that happen, during, say, World Economic Forum or other, big global trade events and economic conferences. Marxist protesters will bandy about this idea that profit is theft. Basically on this notion, right? Excuse me. If the workers are the ones adding the value to a product, which allows owners to profit, essentially the owners are stealing all of that extra value created by the workers and keeping as much of it for themselves as possible, right? Often without fair pay, fair recompense, and all of that stuff. So, if the workers owned the means of production themselves in Marxist thought, they could benefit entirely from from that surplus value. If you cut the bourgeoisie out, you could basically have, workers directly controlling that. And this is where you get ideas of things like co-ops, right? Or worker-owned enterprises comes out of this kind of notion from a sort of Marxist or Marxian economics that, the workers should control the business, and therefore they would, get the dividends and they would get all of that stuff that comes out of any particular business. Okay. So I think in mainstream economics, right, if you go over to the Department of Economics, you would see that this concept has been pretty widely abandoned because it tends to undervalue the role of capital, right, the role of monetary investment, and how much owners or people who provide capital, whether it be investors or banks or whatever, plays in the production of value, right? Equally, I think, especially Austrian economics will say, okay, great, but if the worker has only his labor and there's no capital to build the factory, well, all the worker has is, say, I don't know, if the pencils are a common example, all you would have is wood, graphite, and a bunch of people standing around in a field, and no factory in which to build the pencil or the car or whatever, right? So all of these things for later schools of economics are more interlinked, right? Capital plays an important role, as does labor, and it's about balancing, the interests of the different groups here that makes for good economics. Okay, and like I said, I think this kind of labor theory of value, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a philosopher, and he was talking about, how he ascribes to a classically liberal labor theory of value, and we had a good chat about Austrian economics and how I don't think that's labor theory of value really works, but you'll commonly find it in disciplines like sociology. Okay, all right, I have a kind of a short clip here. So this is from a movie called Metropolis. It's old. It's another silent film. I promise I won't show you too many more of this, but it's kind of illustrative in a way, because it gives you a sort of Marxist view of what they felt kind of towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century that capitalism was. So this film comes out, it's a really interesting film, and if you ever go take film studies, which I know you're engineers, you probably don't have time, you might encounter this film as an example of a artistic movement called German Expressionism, which was a kind of Marxist artistic movement, and it focused on dark shadows, really sharp shapes, as a way of expressing kind of what's going on inside characters. So what you'll see, in this, and again, it's pretty short, is a picture of kind of industrial society. And I think the story of the film, it's been a while since I watched it, is that the main character is like a prince, of a city who wanders down into the industrial sector of that city and experiences what it's like for workers to live in this part of the city. And it's kind of a horror, right? How, and you'll see at one point it looks like the factory is eating people. This is the kind of Marxist notion that the factory system consumes human lives. So I'll play a brief clip from, it's like about 4 minutes, from Metropolis. So this prince has wandered down into the industrial sector. So this guy's clearly been working so long and so hard that he's collapsing, right? But he has to pull that lever or the pressure will rise too high. Uh-oh. All right, that's probably enough. Okay, so you kind of get the idea, right? This is a kind of Marxist vision of what industry does, right? It's a sort of demon that consumes the working class, right? It just kind of eats them whole. So it's a very monstrous vision. And again, this is kind of what Marxists thought in a lot of ways. Okay, another quick clip here. This is just a very quick marks on what work does to workers, especially this idea of alienation.
Karl Marx on alienation. Karl Marx believed that work, at its best, is what makes us human. It fulfills our species' essence, as he put it. Work allows us to live, to be creative, to flourish. However, the reality in 19th century Europe was that work destroyed workers, particularly those who had nothing to sell but their labor. To the mill and factory owners, a worker was simply an abstract idea with a stomach that needed to be filled. The workers had no choice but to toil long hours for a pitiful wage. What was worse, their labor alienated them. Alienation is a disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Factory labor, under capitalism, alienated the workers from the product of their labor. They made stuff they couldn't afford to buy, which disappeared to shops in far-off places, to make money for people who paid them next to nothing. The factory production line split jobs into meaningless tasks that made the hours at work tedious, empty, and bleak. They became cogs in a gigantic machine. Workers lived for the few hours at home when they could eat, sleep, and relax. The rest of the time, they weren't fully alive. This work also alienated them from each other. The only way out of this drudgery, Marx argued, was for the workers to organize and revolt. They needed to seize the means of production, leading to his famous rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains."
Okay. So, Smith's invisible hand seems to be driven via self-interest. Everyone is pursuing their own self-interest, which drives the growth of the overall market. Does Marxism have an alternative way of incentivizing growth in the market and the economy? Okay, that's actually a really interesting question. So, I mean, I think what you're articulating in, there's a third part. Oh, sorry, I didn't read the third part. If surplus value is theft, why should an individual start any enterprise or project that would result in growth in the economy? Okay, all this kind of goes together. It's really interesting. Okay, so this idea of, I think the way that you're articulating it, in a sense, is a very neoliberal, right? So a sort of, when liberalism gets reworked in the 1970s and 80s by people at University of Chicago, like Milton Friedman, they get this kind of, they come up with a slogan, greed is good, right? That greed is good, greed drives capitalism, capitalism drives growth, it makes everybody's lives better. And it's sort of what you're getting at here. And yes, for Smith, there's definitely, and classical economics, there's definitely this sense that, yeah, someone acting in their own self-interest basically creates new products. It's in pursuing your own self-interest that you create new products, you try to find those niches and things get better. But I think Smith has a slightly more elevated view of human beings than just like greed is good. He also thinks that, in part what drives people is a desire to create things that are useful for others, right? To use your labor in useful and meaningful ways, right? So you're trying to find things that actually make other people's lives better, right? You're trying to produce a sort of social value for Smith. And yes, that can get you, that helps the economy, that can make you rich and all of that stuff. So in pursuing your own self-interest, right, in trying to find ways that your skills or your ideas can ultimately better the lives of other people, you end up making your life better too, right? And I mean, like for example, I have a friend, he's very much kind of, in the greed is good sort of mindset. He's a developer. But, in his desire to build, housing in and around the university, right? He owns a property I think he's breaking ground on, or he's broken ground. He's going to start pouring the foundation sometime this month just over by McKernan. He's also creating what are going to be really nice living spaces for people, right? And so you're offering a social value, something that's good for society. And yes, you're incentivized to do this because it can help you, but it helps other people too. Marxism struggles with an alternative, right, of incentivizing growth. When it's been put into practice, one of the problems with Marxism, has tended to be state-directed, right? So because how to put this? Marx is a really, really, like I have a slide on Marx as a futurologist, but I'll spoil kind of what's there. Marx is really bad at predicting the future, right? He predicts that the workers are going to overthrow, the bourgeoisie, and they're going to create this state where everybody, there's common ownership of the means of production, and you're going to go, from each according to ability and to each according to need, right? So you're going to want to create, to do your best in the economy, because it's for the good of all mankind. And it's so, I would say, contrary to how human beings actually are, to human nature, if you will, that when you get to, the Soviets, right? The Soviets are the first really to attempt this, after the Russian Revolution. And what the Soviets and kind of Marxist-Leninist thought comes up with is that you're actually going to need to create a new you're going to need what they call a revolution in human nature. And so the goal of especially the early Soviets, it gets tamped down a little bit once Stalin gets in there, because he has different concerns. But early kind of Soviet thinkers were like, what we need to transcend, Homo sapien, and we need to create a new species of human, which they dub the Homo Sovieticus, right? The new Soviet man, that would have this kind of incentive, not driven by self-interest, but driven by duty to other people in the country and the party and the state, right, and the common good. That doesn't really work out, right? The Homo Sovieticus ends up being more of a philosophical creation than an actual one. And what happens is, productivity in the Soviet Union lags far behind. There's very little desire or need for innovation, right? Because you get quotas, and if you make your 1,500 shirts, you exhaust your budget. There's no, whatever, you hit your quota, it doesn't matter. There's no need to increase, efficiency or make it better. And famously, like, some economic historians have pointed to the fact that the Soviet Union never produced a good quality pair of blue jeans as a sort of marker that the Soviet Union never really could quite master, the efficient and highly productive parts of economics. And I mean, coming out of the Second World War, the top two economies in the world are the United States on top and the Soviet Union number two. And basically through the next 4 decades, the Soviet Union just drops further and further down. So by the time the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, it's sitting, despite having a population of like 400 million people, it's sitting like 8th. It's fallen behind West Germany, right? Not all of Germany, just the western part of Germany in terms of economic production, and places like Japan have massively exceeded it. Okay, so that's part 2. Marxism, never solves this problem. And still hasn't, right? There's still no example of a Marxist state that's highly economically productive, except for maybe like China, but China basically implemented a market system with a communist party ruling it. So it's a slightly odd thing. Okay, and if surplus value is theft, why should an individual start an enterprise or project which would result in economic growth? Right, that's it. That's the problem. That's the problem with Marxist economics. It has no incentive for people to create new categories or to come up with new things, other than service to mankind. But, if it comes down to service to mankind or sitting on your ass, watching TV, you're probably going to sit on your butt and watch TV. So I hope I answered that. But yeah, this is one of the big problems in economics. Okay. So I might have spoiled a little bit of this. But Marx, as a historian, and I will say this of Marx as a historian, he's a lousy historian. He's an interesting sociologist, but he's a really bad historian. Okay, so Marx thinks that history basically functions on what's called a dialectic, right? And he takes this idea from a German philosopher named Hegel. And basically, a dialectic is you have a thesis, antithesis, and it moves into a synthesis. And how Marx thinks this works in history is you have a change in the means of production. You get a change which leads to a change in the social relations of production, which will lead to a new society, right? A new social order. And this is how he thinks history moves, right? Basically, at some point, people figure out new ways of making things. That changes the way that society is organized so that you can take advantage of that new way of making things, and you get a new social order that overthrows the old one, right? So basically, Marx is an economic materialist in his thinking, so he thinks the only thing that happens in history is economics, right? Economic changes. And he sees all of history, right? And this is the opening line of the Communist Manifesto. All the hitherto history of mankind is the history of class conflict, right? That's how he opens the Communist Manifesto. So he just sees class conflicts between haves and have-nots, The haves trying to hold on to what they have and get more, and the have-nots trying to get up in the kind of socioeconomic ladder. Okay, I think I got everything there. Okay. All right. This is kind of Marx's vision of how society works. Wow, I'm getting non-stop text messages. I just dropped my phone. I'll just pick it up later. Okay, so he thinks that society basically kind of looks like this, right? That basically what really matters and what's at the foundation of society is what he calls the base, right? The economic and social base. So what do you have there? You have basically the relations of production, right? Or so this is the social relations of production. Oops, sorry, I colored way too much there. I'll erase the bottom of my circle. Try again. Okay, so you have the relations of production, right? So in this case, for capitalism, you have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, ideas of private property, capital and commodities that are owned. And then you have, the means of production, machines, factories, raw material extraction, and all of that. And that is the economy. And the economy is what basically gives shape to society. So what sits above the economy is what he calls the superstructure, right? And the superstructure is basically, all the institutions of society. So you see there, media, religion, politics, family, culture, education, are all basically the institutions of society. And what he thinks is basically whatever the economic system gives shape to society, right? So basically, all of those institutions will morph and reshape in order to serve the economic system. So things like media, religion, family, education, if you get a change in the means of production and then the social relations of production, you're then going to get all these institutions basically serving that new system. So things like, education starts to be about things like giving you skills, right? And I'm sure, we've all probably said it. Well, I've said it to my kids. You don't have kids for the most part. But people say this to their kids, right? You need to go to school so you can get a good job, right? That's a really kind of crude sentiment, but it's a way of sort of expressing, what Marx would think of as what goes on in the superstructure, right? Is that education starts to serve the capitalist economy, right? Why did people need to learn to read and write after industrialization? So they could be helpful factory workers. And a lot of Marxist historians think that public education, right, where you sit in a desk and you obey the commands of a teacher, right, is all about teaching you kind of the structure of what a factory is going to look like. You're going to have to listen to the manager and do what they tell you to do and be obedient. So you learn those structures in places like, in places like religion, in places like the family, and in education, right? And then obviously, politics, he thinks, serves it, by making laws that explicitly sort of support this. So the base shapes the superstructure according to Marx, right? The society you get is a result of the economic system you have, and the superstructure maintains the base, right? It makes sure that all the conditions so that economic system can remain in place continue to be there. Okay. I think I ruined this. I will say I have this copy of the Communist Manifesto, and it's quite beautiful with the red flag. It's a stupid book, but whatever. It looks nice on a shelf. Okay, so Marx predicted that the next dialectic would be from capitalism to communism, right? Which would be essentially, not a change in the means of production, because Marx didn't think that anything was going to be better at producing stuff than capitalism. He just wanted to take all of that great productive capacity and hand it over to the proletariat, right? So they would rise up, overthrow their bourgeois masters, kill them, and take the means of production. And then, common property for the common good, be as productive as capitalism, but, everyone would get what they need from it and contribute what they could to it, right? So if you were super smart, like all of you are, right, and could be engineers, you would go and be engineers and contribute. And the person who, isn't as capable, maybe they would be a clerk in a grocery store. But each of you would contribute what you could, and each of you would get what you need, right? So That's the kind of idea. Okay, so one really, really huge problem for Marx and Marxist thought. Well, Marx dies, obviously, before any of this happens, but a really big problem for Marxist thought. After Marx dies, people continue to carry on this idea. His ideas are very influential through the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. But a genuine revolution along kind of Marxist terms doesn't occur except in Russia. And this is a genuine problem, right? Because the big industrial economies of the world at that point are, the USA, the UK, France, Germany, and eventually, like when you get more into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Japan. Russia is an absolute also-ran in this race. Russia is way behind. It has maybe, 5 industrial centers, but they're, Moscow, St. Petersburg, maybe like Nizhny Novgorod, Perm. But they're small compared to the industrial centers in Western Europe. Its economy is tiny, and even, they've only liberated their serfs, right? So peasants who are tied to the land. It doesn't happen until well into the late part of the 19th century. So Russia is really backwards compared to all of these industrial powers. But you get no communist revolutions happening here, but a communist revolution happening here. And really, it's slightly engineered because essentially to weaken the Russians during the end part of the First World War, the Germans send Lenin back on a protected train back into Russia, essentially to cause trouble. And boy, does he! He basically takes over the whole country. But it isn't exactly like a workers' revolution, because Lenin and most of the Bolsheviks aren't exactly proletarians, right? They are kind of part of the educated elites. They just happen to really love Marxist thought. So this whole idea that there's going to be a genuine workers' revolt never really happens. You get worker movements, often with kind of Marxist principles in mind in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A lot of that, leads to unions, leads to gradual improvements in working conditions. And capitalists also figure out along kind of classical economic lines that giving people nicer working conditions makes them more productive, right? If they're happier, they're more productive. The skill of workers also grows, which means they can demand higher wages. They're harder to replace. And then you get the emergence of kind of middle management, which also alleviates a lot of the problems because they're also highly skilled and highly paid. So conditions for workers in the West and in these major industrial countries gets much better, and people don't feel like they need a communist revolution. Things happen. Now, that doesn't stop, the Marxists from kind of dreaming of a Marxist revolution, right? I don't know if you've seen the posters around campus. There's still people on this campus agitating for a Marxist revolution. I hopefully only like 2 or 3 of them. I always think it's funny that they put up like Lenin as a figure, because Lenin is a mass murdering, piece of human garbage. Not quite on the level of Hitler, but certainly, no one should ever think Lenin was a great guy. And I say this as someone who's stood 2 feet from Lenin's waxy preserved body on Red Square. It's weird, but he's still encased in a glass case on Red Square, mummified for all time. I think because the Russians can't quite figure out what they should do with him. But it's super creepy. All right, so Marxist scholars, start to worry about this problem. Like, why hasn't there been a revolution? And what they cue in on is culture, right? So essentially, they think that capitalism keeps everybody basically tricked into thinking that capitalism is a great system for workers, basically through the creation of what they call false consciousness, right? And it's done with things like Hollywood movies, television, right? What they call the culture industry. So they really start to focus on things like culture as keeping the capitalist system going, right? And so they think that capitalism rules inherently not so much by, force when it doesn't have to, as by ideology, right? And it spreads its ideology through culture. So when you're watching, a movie where everyone is kind of fabulously beautiful and wealthy, right? It takes place in California, or I don't know. I'm trying to think, like, they don't really have sitcoms anymore, but if you've ever seen an episode of Friends where these 30-somethings live in these towering New York apartments that are beautiful, right? This is what the culture industry is for guys like Horkheimer and Adorno. It's like, America, it's so good. Okay. The other thing that these Marxists start to think that capitalism does is basically keep you working based on what they call false need. Okay, so this comes from this guy, Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse is a German scholar. He comes over to the United States during the war because he's Jewish. And obviously, before the war, obviously the Nazis don't like Jews very much. So they come, he comes with Horkheimer and Adorno to the United States and brings Marxist thought with him. And what, in terms of work, one of the things that's really interesting about, these kind of later Marxist scholars is that they say, okay, capitalism is really good at meeting everyone's basic needs, right? But there's the inherent problem in capitalism. And it basically, right, sorry, let me just slow my brain down a little bit because I could talk Marcuse all day. But let me summarize it for you. So capitalism very quickly will produce all the things you need to live, right? So very quickly, it's efficient at producing housing, food, clothing, and a lot of that stuff will last you for a really long time. But how then, Marcuse asks, does capitalism keep going after it's provided for everyone's basic needs? Well, what he says is that it produces what's called false need. Basically, what Marxists think is that the reason you keep going to work every day, right, or the reason your parents do or whoever's working, is because, not so much because your needs still need to be met. Most of your needs have probably been met, at least at a basic level, and could be met with very little continual work, right? Especially as automation gets better, right? Growing the food you need could be done by fewer and fewer people. But it does it by basically convincing you that you need a bunch of stuff that you don't need. So, right, every year, I don't know when it happens, but it's going to happen at some point. Apple holds its event in California, right? I think it's Apple World or whatever it's called, where they launch the next iPhone, right? So I guess we're going to be at the iPhone 17, coming up this year. And what Marcuse would say is, probably once you got, to the iPhone itself or the iPhone 4, that device did pretty much everything you could dream of, and it was very, very good at it. But because Apple is a capitalist company, if Apple is going to continue to generate profit, right, it needs to convince you every single year that your iPhone 16 is a piece of crap that you need to replace with this much better iPhone, right? And that the last year's model, and if you ever watch these events, and they're really long and boring, but it's an interesting kind of thing if you can think of it through a Marxist lens. It's like, okay, they'll tell you the iPhone 16 is 4.5% faster than the iPhone 15 was, right? The new chip, or they usually go bigger orders of magnitude. It's like 10 times faster. The chip is 10 times faster. The camera is 8 times better, and it has all of these new features. Now, as someone who's owned a smartphone since like 2010, I can say most of the new features on most smartphones I use for like 5 minutes. And then I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And then, I go back to doing the one thing I do with my smartphone, or the few things: texting, taking pictures, and doom scrolling Twitter. But aside from that, right, I don't need 99% of the things that my smartphone does. But if capitalism is going to keep working, it needs to create a false sense that, oh my gosh, my Pixel 7a is so outdated. I need to get the Pixel 9 Pro or whatever it happens to be. Partially so that they will continue to generate profit, but also so that they can keep me coming to work every day. Because at a certain point, what Marcuse says is people would just stop showing up for capitalism if they could be convinced that having their basic needs met, they would rather, sit at home and write poetry or study jazz or whatever, right? Marcuse has a very high notion of what people would do in their spare time, by the way. It's like everybody would improve themselves and become a poet and live out their dream of being a playwright. Having lived through COVID, I'm like, I think mostly when people have nothing to do, they will, play video games and watch porn. I think that's mostly what people do if they don't go to work. But, Marcuse had an ideal view of people. Okay, so what Marcuse says then is people under capitalism become these one-dimensional creatures. All they do is consume. They consume, and capitalism creates one-dimensional people who just consume product, right? And get excited about next product. Basically, you're kept in this system of production via the media, advertising, and industrial models. And particularly, and he's critical especially of the car industry here, the car industry, I guess you could talk about the tech industry too, does this as well. The idea of planned obsolescence, right? That basically, eventually your thing is going to break. Or there was a scandal with Apple a few years ago, right? Where it was shown that your software update that you got actually slowed your phone down and made it worse. Apple said it was, because as batteries got older, you need to slow it down to keep the phone working for longer. But people noticed this, as you installed the iOS updates, your phone got worse and worse, right? The battery life got worse, it got slower, and all of this stuff. And Marcuse thinks this is a feature of capitalism because you're like, God, my iPhone 15 is so terrible now. I need to go buy the 17 or whatever it happens to be, right? Or, your car breaks and can't be fixed easily, so you have to go buy a new car. He also thinks that, capitalism and consumerism gives people the illusion of choice. You think you have freedom, but you only really have choice to choose what you buy. Like, does it matter if you buy a Samsung or a Pixel or an iPhone? Marcuse says not really. Okay. A couple more Marxist slides. Maybe we'll try to get through that in the next 7 minutes. These ones we can sum up pretty quickly. Okay, so another kind of thinker here is Althusser. And I think what Althusser, we can sum up what Althusser says really quickly about capitalism. And mostly he thinks that, again, it rules by ideology. Most of what it does is keeping us, in a capitalist mode of thinking by constantly reaffirming the norms of capitalism through all of our institutions, right? So you're here, being told you need the skills to get a good job, so you can consume next product. And that the good life is a life where you consume next product, right? And that's the sort of Marxist notion. And only when things go really bad, do you have to bring in, so he calls, the ideological part of society, family, media, religion, schools that reinforce the ideology of capitalism, the ideological state apparatus. And it's like when that breaks down, right, and you get riots and, people, civil disobedience, sometimes you have to bring in the RSA or the repressive state apparatus. But mostly capitalism works really well by controlling your mind. Okay, and again, a lot of this is based on this cat, Antonio Gramsci. Same kind of idea, capitalism rules by ideas, and especially he has this idea that capitalism rules by turning its ideas into common sense, right? So when you think, well, if I work hard, it's common sense that if I work hard, apply myself, get great grades in school, that I will succeed, right? That's just common sense. For Gramsci, you have been infected by the hegemonic ideas of the ruling class that basically, keep you constantly in this mode of serving the interests of the powerful. Now, for him, typically what we end up with as common sense is the idea of the dominant class, right? The capitalists, the bourgeois, But the victory is never final, and one of the things that Gramsci and people that follow him think is how capitalism has been able to survive is that it's subtly able to change in minor ways, basically to absorb ideas that it can live with, and often to its benefit, without actually changing the system. And one of the examples that people sometimes use of this is women's liberation or kind of feminism. One of the things that happened right in the 1960s is there was a big push for female equality, right? And women wanted to go from being mostly in the domestic sphere, at home raising the kids, to working. And what Gramsci would say is capitalism is like, okay, we did have this male-centric idea of the family breadwinner, which would be the man, but we could absorb this idea of women wanting to come to work, and in a sense it's good for us because it's twice as many workers, right? Which means we can use women entering the market, to keep wages low. Again, this is a very Marxist view. It's like, okay, Marxism can absolutely let women capitalism can absolutely let women into the workforce, and it's great because twice as many workers means the workers that are there can't demand as high of wages because we can just go get someone else. Okay. Can I answer this in 3 minutes? Working class, in particular the global south, greatly suffer from massive human rights violations to lower the cost of production. How do we address the division of the working class by the bourgeoisie when the distribution of wealth can only be influenced by those who own the means of production within the neoliberal vision of capitalism? Okay, that's an interesting, and this is a really common critique of kind of neoliberal economics, right? That basically, we've moved the proletariat to the global south. I'm trying to think if I can answer this in 3 minutes. The neoliberal explanation is basically that, people are going, as you go from no industry to industry, right, in a place like Bangladesh, it's going to suck for a while, right, because workers are very low skilled. They don't have the ability to demand much in terms of wages or better working conditions, but it's by developing those industries that they'll eventually move up and be able to demand more stuff, right? But it's going to suck for a long time. And basically, what a neoliberal would say is they're going through that same process that Europe, America, and Japan went through. It's just that we're already there. So from our point of view, that looks really bad, right? It looks really bad to have people in these cramped, unsafe factories. But every society that industrializes sort of goes through this until its workers gain enough skill that you can move into those more skilled things. And so, it's going to take time basically as you build up those skills, but the only way to do it is to go through that process. That's not, I think, a very satisfying answer in some way because it doesn't sound very moral, but for neoliberal kind of economists, there's not really a morality in capitalism, right? There's just the crude facts of what you can do and what you can't do and what economics demands. Okay, I'm going to clear that off. And I understand the critique though. Okay, let's... We'll stop there. We only have 1 minute, and we'll get into the Austrians next time because I think some of their economic thinking, especially about labor, matters a lot.